Behind closed doors in the mountains of Manchuria, something unthinkable was happening. Scientists in white coats moved through sterile corridors, their footsteps echoing against concrete walls. But this wasn't healing they were after. This was horror disguised as research. Between 1937 and 1945, Unit 731 operated as Japan's most classified biological warfare program. Hidden from the world, masked as a water purification unit, it was actually a factory of human experimentation. Men, women, and children were subjected to procedures so brutal that even decades later, the full truth remains buried in classified documents and survivor testimonies. This isn't just another dark chapter in wartime history. This is the story of how medical science became a weapon, how ordinary people became test subjects, and how an entire nation tried to erase the evidence of what they had done. The experiments conducted here would make the world's most notorious medical atrocities seem tame by comparison. Frostbite testing, live vivisection, biological weapon trials, all carried out on conscious victims who were never meant to survive. What makes this story even more chilling is how it was covered up. After the war ended, the perpetrators weren't prosecuted. Instead, they were granted immunity in exchange for their research data. The victims were forgotten, their suffering buried beneath layers of political convenience and scientific curiosity. Today, most people have never heard of Unit 731, despite it being one of the largest human experimentation programs in recorded history. The facility was massive, sprawling across 6 square kilometers in occupied Manchuria. It housed over 3,000 researchers, technicians, and support staff. But the numbers that matter most are the ones that were never officially recorded. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 10,000 people died within these walls, though the true figure could be much higher. These weren't soldiers captured in battle. They were civilians, including women and children, systematically murdered in the name of scientific progress. The man behind this operation was Shiro Ishii, a microbiologist who convinced Japan's military leadership that biological weapons could win the war. He wasn't some rogue scientist working in isolation. He had backing from the highest levels of government, unlimited funding, and complete freedom to pursue his research without ethical constraints. Under his direction, Unit 731 became a place where human beings were reduced to experimental materials, referred to not as people but as logs, as if they were nothing more than wood to be burned. What happened at Unit 731 challenges everything we think we know about medical ethics, wartime conduct, and human nature itself. These weren't experiments conducted in the heat of battle or moments of desperation. They were systematic, methodical, and documented with scientific precision. The researchers kept detailed records, took photographs, and published papers based on their findings. They treated mass murder as just another day at the office. The location wasn't chosen randomly. Manchuria provided the perfect cover, far from prying eyes and international oversight. The Japanese had established the puppet state of Manchukuo in 1932, giving them complete control over the region. Local populations were already being oppressed, making it easier to acquire test subjects without attracting attention. The facility was disguised as the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, a name that would sound benign to anyone who might ask questions. But the real genius of the operation was its integration into Japan's broader military strategy. This wasn't just about developing biological weapons for some future conflict. Unit 731 was actively deploying these weapons against Chinese civilians, conducting field tests that killed thousands more. Plague-infected fleas were dropped over cities, wells were poisoned with cholera, and contaminated food was distributed to unsuspecting populations. The entire program was designed to perfect the art of biological warfare through live human testing. The researchers themselves came from Japan's most prestigious universities. They were trained physicians, microbiologists, and scientists who had taken oaths to do no harm. Yet they participated in experiments that would make medieval torture chambers seem humane. They justified their actions through a combination of racial ideology, scientific curiosity, and patriotic duty. In their minds, they weren't committing atrocities, they were serving their emperor and advancing human knowledge. The victims came from all walks of life. Chinese civilians captured during military operations, Soviet prisoners of war, Korean independence fighters, and even some Japanese citizens who had fallen out of favor with the authorities. They were transported to the facility in windowless train cars, processed through a dehumanizing intake system, and assigned numbers instead of names. From that moment on, they ceased to exist as human beings in the eyes of their captors. What makes Unit 731 particularly disturbing is how it perverted the principles of medical research. These weren't crude torture sessions carried out by sadistic guards. They were carefully planned experiments conducted by educated professionals using scientific methodology. The researchers measured, documented, and analyzed every aspect of human suffering. They turned pain into data, death into statistics, and human dignity into experimental variables. The facility included multiple buildings, each designed for specific types of research. There were laboratories for studying infectious diseases, surgical suites for live dissections, and specialized chambers for testing the effects of extreme temperatures, pressure changes, and chemical exposure. The entire complex was designed to maximize the efficiency of human experimentation while maintaining the appearance of legitimate scientific research. The secrecy surrounding Unit 731 was absolute. Researchers signed oaths of silence, and security measures were implemented to prevent any information from leaking out. Even within the facility, knowledge was compartmentalized so that most staff members only knew about their specific areas of work. This system of secrecy would prove crucial in covering up the program's existence after the war ended. The psychological impact on the researchers themselves is another disturbing aspect of this story. Many participants later described how they gradually became desensitized to human suffering. What initially shocked them became routine. They developed elaborate justifications for their actions and created a culture where questioning the ethics of their work was considered unpatriotic. Some even reported feeling excited about their research, viewing it as groundbreaking scientific work rather than systematic murder. The technological capabilities of Unit 731 were impressive, even by today's standards. They had equipment for mass-producing biological agents, sophisticated laboratory facilities, and even their own airfield for testing biological weapon delivery systems. The Japanese military invested enormous resources in this program, viewing it as potentially decisive in their plans for regional domination. Perhaps most chilling of all is how normal life continued around the facility. Local civilians lived nearby, unaware of what was happening behind the walls. Japanese families lived in comfortable housing provided for the researchers, and children played in areas adjacent to the laboratories where people were being systematically murdered. This normalization of evil, this ability to compartmentalize atrocity, reveals something profound about human nature that we're still trying to understand. The story of Unit 731 isn't just about what happened in those laboratories. It's about how entire societies can become complicit in unthinkable acts, how scientific progress can be twisted into instruments of oppression, and how the pursuit of knowledge without ethical constraints can lead to the darkest chapters in human history. The victims of Unit 731 weren't just the people who died in those experiments. They were humanity's faith in the healing power of medicine, trust in scientific institutions, and belief that educated people would naturally choose compassion over cruelty. The brutality of Unit 731 extended far beyond the confines of its laboratories. This was systematic destruction on an industrial scale, where human beings were reduced to test subjects in what can only be described as a factory of death. The experiments conducted weren't isolated incidents of cruelty. They were part of a calculated program designed to weaponize disease and suffering. The vivisection procedures represent perhaps the most horrifying aspect of their work. Prisoners were subjected to live dissection without anesthesia, their bodies carved open while they remained conscious. The researchers wanted to observe the effects of various pathogens on living tissue, so they couldn't risk the complications that painkillers might introduce. Men, women, and children were strapped to tables and systematically dismantled like machines being taken apart for study. Frostbite experiments pushed the boundaries of human endurance in ways that defy comprehension. Prisoners were forced outside in sub-zero temperatures, their limbs exposed to the elements until flesh turned black with necrosis. Then researchers would test different methods of treatment, often involving scalding water or extreme heat, watching as victims screamed in agony. The goal was to understand how Japanese soldiers might better survive harsh winter conditions, but the methods revealed a complete abandonment of human decency. The biological warfare testing went even further into the realm of absolute evil. Prisoners were infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and other deadly pathogens, then monitored as the diseases ravaged their bodies. Some were given experimental treatments. Others were left to die while researchers took detailed notes. The facility maintained its own breeding programs for fleas and rats, creating perfect vectors for disease transmission that could later be deployed against enemy populations. What makes this even more disturbing is how methodical everything was. This wasn't random violence or crimes of passion, it was bureaucratic evil carried out with scientific precision. Every experiment was documented, every result cataloged, every death recorded in meticulous detail. The researchers treated human suffering as data points, reducing the most fundamental violations of human dignity to statistical analyses and research papers. The psychological experiments were equally devastating. Prisoners were subjected to extreme temperature variations, pressure changes, and sensory deprivation designed to break their minds before their bodies gave out. Some were buried alive to test survival limits. Others were exposed to electrical currents or chemical agents that caused excruciating pain. The researchers wanted to understand the limits of human endurance, but they approached this question with the cold detachment of scientists studying laboratory rats. Children weren't spared from this nightmare. Pregnant women were infected with diseases to study the effects on fetal development. Infants were subjected to the same brutal experiments as adults, their smaller bodies providing researchers with different data sets to analyze. The facility operated its own nursery where children born to prisoner mothers were raised specifically for experimentation, a detail that reveals the truly systematic nature of their cruelty. The facility's integration into Japan's broader military strategy cannot be understated. Unit 731 wasn't operating in isolation. It was part of a coordinated effort to develop biological weapons that could be deployed against Chinese cities and potentially Allied forces. The research conducted in those laboratories was directly applied to military operations, with plague-infected fleas being dropped on Chinese communities and water supplies being contaminated with deadly pathogens. The death toll from these biological attacks is staggering. Entire villages were wiped out by engineered outbreaks of plague and cholera. The attacks on Chinese cities like Changde and Ningbo killed thousands of civilians, with the diseases spreading far beyond the initial target areas. These weren't military installations being attacked. They were civilian populations being subjected to biological warfare that violated every principle of international law. The cover-up began even before the war ended. As Allied forces closed in on Japanese positions, Unit 731 began destroying evidence of their activities. Buildings were demolished, documents burned, and remaining prisoners were executed to eliminate witnesses. The facility's staff were given new identities and relocated to avoid prosecution, while the physical evidence of their crimes was systematically erased. The post-war immunity deals represent one of the most morally compromising decisions in modern history. American intelligence officials, led by figures like General Douglas MacArthur and biological warfare specialist Dr. Edwin Hill, made the calculated decision to grant immunity to Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research data. The justification was that this information would be valuable in defending against Soviet biological weapons programs. But the cost was allowing mass murderers to escape justice. Dr. Shiro Ishii, the architect of these atrocities, never faced trial for his crimes. Instead, he lived comfortably in post-war Japan, consulting for American biological warfare programs and maintaining his position in Japanese society. Many of his subordinates went on to successful careers in medicine and academia, their involvement in war crimes either hidden or ignored by institutions that should have held them accountable. The victims of Unit 731 received no such consideration. Survivors were often too traumatized to speak about their experiences, and those who did were frequently dismissed or ignored. The Chinese government's focus on rebuilding after the war meant that documenting these atrocities took a back seat to more immediate concerns. For decades, the full scope of Unit 731's crimes remained largely unknown to the public. This conspiracy of silence extended beyond government circles into academic and medical communities. Research data obtained from Unit 731 was quietly integrated into American biological warfare programs, with scientists either unaware of its origins or choosing to ignore the ethical implications. The normalization of this knowledge transfer reveals how easily institutions can become complicit in covering up atrocities when it serves their perceived interests. The psychological impact on survivors and their families cannot be measured in simple statistics. Those who lived through Unit 731's experiments carried physical and emotional scars that lasted for generations. Many suffered from chronic health problems related to their treatment, while others struggled with psychological trauma that was never properly addressed or acknowledged. The broader implications of Unit 731 extend far beyond the immediate victims. This facility represented a complete breakdown of the ethical frameworks that are supposed to govern scientific research and medical practice. The researchers involved weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were educated professionals who had been trained in the same scientific traditions that produced beneficial medical advances. Their transformation into perpetrators of mass atrocities reveals how quickly moral boundaries can erode when authority figures provide justification for crossing them. The institutional support for Unit 731 came from the highest levels of Japanese government and military leadership. This wasn't a rogue operation carried out by a few extremists. It was an officially sanctioned program that received funding, resources, and protection from the state. The facility's existence was known to government officials who made conscious decisions to allow these experiments to continue. But even as the world began to uncover the truth about Unit 731, the real horror wasn't just what happened within those walls. It was how systematically the evidence was destroyed, how testimonies were silenced, and how justice was traded away for scientific data. This wasn't just about covering up war crimes. This was about erasing history itself. The Americans knew exactly what they were getting into when they struck their deal with Ishii and his team. Documents declassified decades later revealed that U.S. military officials were fully aware of the human experimentation program. They knew about the vivisections, the biological weapons testing, the mass murder disguised as research. But they made a calculated decision. The data was too valuable to prosecute. General MacArthur's administration worked hand in hand with Ishii to ensure that no evidence would ever reach the International Military Tribunal. Witnesses were relocated, documents were confiscated and classified. Survivors were intimidated into silence. The message was clear. This never happened, and for decades it worked. The Japanese government played their part perfectly. Official records were destroyed, textbooks were sanitized, an entire generation grew up with no knowledge of Unit 731. When survivors or their families tried to speak out, they were dismissed as attention seekers or communist agitators. The state had spoken, and the state said there was nothing to remember. This systematic erasure went far beyond simple cover-up. It was a deliberate campaign to rewrite history, to present Japan as a victim of war rather than a perpetrator of atrocities. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became the focal point of Japan's wartime narrative, overshadowing everything else. Unit 731 became a footnote, then a rumor, then nothing at all. The scientific community was complicit in this silence. Researchers who had worked with Unit 731 data published papers without revealing the source of their information. Medical journals accepted studies based on human experimentation without asking questions. The knowledge gained from torture and murder was integrated into mainstream medicine. sanitized and legitimized. Dr. Ishii himself lived comfortably in post-war Japan, never facing trial, never acknowledging his crimes. He worked as a consultant for the US military, helping them understand biological warfare. The man who had overseen the systematic torture and murder of thousands was now a respected expert, his expertise valued precisely because of what he had done. The other researchers scattered across Japan's medical establishment. Some became department heads at prestigious universities. Others founded pharmaceutical companies. A few went into government service. They carried their secrets with them, but they also carried their careers forward, unimpeded by justice or accountability. This pattern of protection and silence wasn't unique to the leadership. Lower-level staff members, technicians, guards, and administrators all found their way back into normal life. Some returned to their families and never spoke of what they had done. Others bragged quietly in bars about their service to the emperor, but none faced consequences. The victims' families suffered in isolation. Chinese and Korean survivors who tried to seek justice found themselves facing not just denial but active hostility. Their testimonies were dismissed as unreliable. Their injuries were attributed to other causes. Their suffering was minimized and marginalized. When former Unit 731 researcher Nyoji Uezono finally broke his silence in the 1980s, describing the human experiments in horrifying detail, he faced immediate backlash. Death threats poured in. Right-wing groups protested outside his home. The Japanese government refused to investigate his claims. The message was clear. Some truths were too dangerous to tell. The psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Many had watched their families die in the most brutal ways imaginable. They had endured torture that defied description, and then they were told it never happened. The trauma of the experience was compounded by the trauma of having that experience denied and erased. Children born to survivors carried this burden forward. They grew up with parents who couldn't speak about their past, who flinched at medical procedures, who woke up screaming from nightmares they couldn't explain. The silence became hereditary, passed down through generations like a genetic disorder. The cover-up created a secondary victimization that in some ways was worse than the original crimes. The experiments had been about dehumanizing people, treating them as objects rather than human beings. The cover-up continued this dehumanization, denying their experiences, their pain, their very existence as victims. This wasn't just about protecting war criminals. It was about protecting a narrative. Japan needed to be seen as a civilized nation worthy of alliance with the United States. The existence of Unit 731 contradicted that narrative. So it had to be erased, not just legally but culturally and historically. The American complicity in this cover-up reveals something equally disturbing about the post-war order. The same nation that had prosecuted Nazi war criminals at Nuremberg was actively protecting Japanese war criminals. The same principles of justice and accountability that had been applied to German atrocities were abandoned when it came to Japanese ones. This selective application of justice sent a message that would echo through subsequent conflicts. War crimes were not universal wrongs to be punished wherever they occurred. They were political tools to be used or ignored depending on strategic interests. The precedent set by the Unit 731 cover-up would influence how the world responded to atrocities for decades to come. The scientific community's acceptance of data derived from human experimentation created its own moral catastrophe. Researchers who built their careers on knowledge gained through torture became complicit in those original crimes. The line between legitimate research and criminal activity became blurred beyond recognition. Even today, the legacy of this cover-up continues to poison relationships between Japan and its neighbors. When Japanese officials visit war shrines or when textbooks minimize wartime atrocities, they are continuing the same pattern of denial that began with Unit 731. The refusal to acknowledge historical truth becomes a source of ongoing conflict and mistrust. The silence surrounding Unit 731 also demonstrates how easily societies can collectively forget inconvenient truths. When governments, institutions, and individuals all have incentives to remain quiet, even the most horrific crimes can disappear from public memory. The mechanisms of forgetting are as powerful as the mechanisms of remembering. This erasure wasn't just about protecting the guilty, it was about protecting the innocent as well, or at least those who believed themselves to be innocent. Acknowledging Unit 731 would have meant acknowledging how many people had been complicit, how many had known and done nothing, how many had benefited from the suffering of others. The cover-up succeeded so completely that when evidence of Unit 731 finally began to emerge in the 1980s, many people genuinely believed it was fabricated. The systematic destruction of evidence and testimony had been so thorough that the truth seemed impossible. Reality had been successfully replaced with a more comfortable fiction. But the truth has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to destroy it. Documents hidden in archives eventually surface. Witnesses eventually speak. Physical evidence eventually emerges. The cover-up of Unit 731 was comprehensive, but it wasn't perfect. And as the full scope of the program became clear, so did the full scope of the betrayal that had hidden it from the world. The silence was deafening. In the aftermath of Japan's surrender in 1945, as the world celebrated the end of World War II, a different kind of war was just beginning. This was a war fought not with bullets or bombs, but with documents, testimonies, and memories. The victims of Unit 731 found themselves facing an enemy perhaps more formidable than the original perpetrators: institutional amnesia. The American occupation forces, led by General Douglas MacArthur, had a choice to make. They could pursue justice for the thousands who had suffered and died in Unit 731's laboratories, or they could secure what they believed was a strategic advantage in the emerging Cold War. They chose the latter. The decision would echo through decades, shaping not just how history remembered Unit 731, but how it was systematically erased from collective memory. Dr. Norbert Fell, chief of the Army Chemical Corps' Intelligence Division, arrived in Japan with a singular mission: extract every piece of biological warfare research from Unit 731, regardless of how it was obtained. What he found exceeded his expectations. The Japanese had conducted experiments that would have been impossible in the United States, both legally and ethically. They had data on human responses to biological agents, detailed records of disease progression, and insights into weaponization that American researchers could only dream of acquiring through legitimate means. The deal was struck in secret. Shiro Ishii and his key researchers would provide complete documentation of their work in exchange for immunity from prosecution. Not just immunity from Japanese courts, but protection from international war crimes tribunals. The United States would shield them from justice, and in return they would receive what American officials euphemistically called invaluable scientific data. This wasn't just a transaction between governments. It was a deliberate choice to prioritize strategic advantage over human dignity. The research that had cost thousands of lives was now being integrated into American biological warfare programs. The very data that represented unthinkable suffering was being treated as a valuable commodity, worth protecting at any cost. The cover-up began immediately. Documents were classified at the highest levels. Testimonies from survivors were dismissed or suppressed. When the International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened to prosecute Japanese war criminals, Unit 731 was conspicuously absent from the proceedings. The judges never heard about the human experiments, the biological weapons, or the systematic murder of thousands of innocent people. Meanwhile, the perpetrators were not only walking free but actively contributing to new weapons programs. Ishii himself worked as a consultant for the U.S. Army's Biological Warfare Division. His subordinates found positions in Japan's emerging pharmaceutical industry, their expertise in human experimentation now channeled into legitimate medical research. The same hands that had performed live vivisections were now developing vaccines and treatments. The Japanese government, eager to rebuild its international reputation, embraced the silence. Textbooks were scrubbed of references to Unit 731 to official histories glossed over the biological warfare program. When pressed by journalists or researchers, government officials would claim ignorance or cite national security concerns. The message was clear: this chapter of history was closed, and it would remain that way. For the survivors, this institutional silence was perhaps more devastating than the original crimes. Those who had witnessed the atrocities, who had lost family members to the experiments, found themselves confronting a wall of denial. Their testimonies were dismissed as unreliable or exaggerated. Their calls for justice were ignored or actively discouraged. Wang Peng, a Chinese farmer who had survived biological weapon attacks in Zhejiang province, spent decades trying to get officials to acknowledge what had happened to his village. He watched as his neighbors died from mysterious illnesses, their bodies covered in lesions that doctors couldn't explain. But when he tried to report these incidents, he was told there was no evidence of biological warfare. The official record showed nothing unusual had occurred. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Many began to question their own memories, wondering if what they had experienced was real or imagined. The gaslighting was systematic and effective. Without official acknowledgement, without documentation, without justice, their trauma existed in a void. This silence had practical consequences as well. Families of victims couldn't receive compensation because the crimes were never officially recognized. Communities affected by biological weapons couldn't get proper medical treatment because doctors weren't told what they were dealing with. The cover-up didn't just hide the past, it actively harmed people in the present. The integration of Unit 731's research into mainstream science created another layer of moral complexity. American researchers who used data from the human experiments rarely questioned its origins. The knowledge gained from torture and murder was being cited in medical journals, used to develop new treatments, and incorporated into public health policies. Dr. Edwin Hill, who led the U.S. evaluation of Japanese biological warfare research, later admitted that the data was obtained from human experimentation. But he justified its use by arguing that the knowledge was too valuable to ignore. This utilitarian calculus, that the ends justified the means, became a recurring theme in how institutions handled the Unit 731 legacy. The Korean War provided another test of this moral framework. As American forces faced the possibility of biological attacks from Chinese and North Korean forces, military planners turned to the expertise they had acquired from Unit 731. The same research techniques, the same strategic thinking, the same disregard for human life that had characterized the Japanese program were now being applied by American forces. The irony was stark. The United States, which had positioned itself as a champion of human rights and democratic values, was now employing the methods and knowledge of one of history's most notorious criminal organizations. The moral authority that America claimed in the post-war world was being undermined by its willingness to embrace the very practices it had ostensibly fought against. By the 1950s, the cover-up had become institutionalized. Multiple government agencies were involved in maintaining the silence. The CIA, the Army, the State Department, and even academic institutions were all complicit in suppressing information about Unit 731. It wasn't just a matter of classification. It was active disinformation. When journalists began investigating rumors of Japanese biological warfare programs, they were met with official denials and misdirection. Government spokesmen would acknowledge that Japan had conducted some biological research during the war, but they characterized it as defensive and limited in scope. The systematic nature of the human experimentation, the scale of the killing, and the integration of this research into American programs were all hidden from public view. The few researchers who managed to uncover pieces of the truth found their careers threatened. Academic institutions, many of which received government funding, were reluctant to support investigations that might embarrass their benefactors. The message was clear. Some subjects were off limits, and pursuing them could have serious consequences. This institutional pressure created a chilling effect that lasted for decades. Even as the Cold War ended and many classified documents were declassified, the Unit 731 files remained sealed. The official justification was always national security, but the real reason was embarrassment. The American government had made a deal with war criminals, and acknowledging that fact would raise uncomfortable questions about American values and priorities. The impact on historical scholarship was profound. Without access to primary sources, without official acknowledgement of the program's scope, researchers were forced to rely on fragmentary evidence and survivor testimony. This created space for deniers to question the entire narrative, arguing that without documentation, the claims about Unit 731 were exaggerated or fabricated. The Japanese government, taking its cue from American silence, became even more aggressive in its denial. Officials argued that there was no credible evidence of human experimentation, that the biological warfare program was minimal, and that claims of systematic atrocities were propaganda from China and North Korea. This denial was made possible by the American decision to suppress evidence and protect the perpetrators. The generational impact was equally devastating. Children and grandchildren of Unit 731 victims grew up without knowing the full truth about what had happened to their families. They were told that their relatives had died of disease or accident, not that they had been murdered in medical experiments. This stolen history created a wound that couldn't heal because it couldn't be acknowledged. For the perpetrators and their families, the silence provided a different kind of burden. Many of the researchers who had worked in Unit 731 went on to have successful careers in medicine and academia. They were respected members of their communities, honored for their contributions to science and public health. But they carried the secret of what they had done, what they had witnessed, and what they had chosen to forget. Some of these men in their final years began to feel the weight of their silence. Naoji Uezono, who had worked as a junior researcher in Unit 731, finally broke his silence in the 1980s. He described the human experiments in graphic detail, the casual cruelty of his superiors, and the systematic dehumanization that made such atrocities possible. But his testimony came decades too late for justice, and it was still dismissed by many as the confused ramblings of an elderly man. The technological revolution of the late 20th century began to crack the wall of silence. Researchers gained access to Soviet archives, which contained documentation of Unit 731 activities. Chinese scholars, empowered by their country's growing international influence, began publishing detailed accounts of the biological warfare program. Survivors, emboldened by changing political climates, started sharing their stories more openly. But even as the truth began to emerge, the institutional response remained defensive. The U.S. government continued to classify documents related to Unit 731, arguing that their release would compromise national security or diplomatic relations. The Japanese government maintained its policy of denial, acknowledging only that regrettable incidents had occurred during the war. The scientific community, which had benefited from Unit 731 research for decades, was reluctant to confront the ethical implications of its complicity. Medical journals that had published research based on human experimentation rarely acknowledged the origins of their data. Universities that had employed former Unit 731 researchers were hesitant to examine their institutional histories. This ongoing silence had contemporary consequences. Without a full accounting of what had happened, without acknowledgement of the crimes, without justice for the victims, the lessons of Unit 731 remained unlearned. The same utilitarian logic that had justified the original cover-up continued to influence policy decisions. The same willingness to sacrifice human rights for strategic advantage persisted in new forms. The story of Unit 731 and its aftermath reveals something profound about how institutions manage inconvenient truths. It shows how the powerful can shape memory, how silence can be weaponized, and how the pursuit of strategic advantage can override moral considerations. Most importantly, it demonstrates that the failure to confront historical atrocities doesn't just dishonor the past, it corrupts the present and endangers the future. Today, as we face new ethical challenges in science, medicine, and international relations, the Unit 731 legacy remains relevant. The questions it raises about the relationship between knowledge and power, about the responsibility of institutions to acknowledge their complicity in atrocities, and about the long-term consequences of choosing convenience over justice, are as urgent now as they were in 1945. The silence surrounding Unit 731 was not just about hiding a war crime. It was about protecting a system that values strategic advantage over human dignity. That system persists, and until we fully confront the truth about Unit 731, we remain vulnerable to repeating its mistakes. The victims of Japan's secret human experiment lab deserve justice in their lifetimes. They deserve truth in ours.